Ryan Mitchell sat across from Victoria in the Eclipse Trust conference room 6 years after their divorce, but the woman who'd once betrayed him for his best friend now held documents proving that Derek Morrison had been working for a rival shadow organization called the Consortium for the past 8 years, meaning Derek's friendship, his betrayal, and even his affair with Victoria had all been an intelligence operation designed to compromise Ryan before he inherited his mother's empire, and Victoria had been an unwitting pawn in a game far larger than either of them understood. The Consortium, according to Victoria's evidence, controlled 43 governments, 6 major tech companies, and was actively working to destabilize Eclipse Trust's operations because Ryan's mother had spent 40 years systematically dismantling their human trafficking networks, their weapons proliferation schemes, and their efforts to monopolize emerging technologies that could enslave humanity rather than liberate it. Derek's law firm wasn't just a prestigious Boston practice, but a front for consortium legal operations, and his partnership had been contingent on successfully neutralizing Ryan as a threat. A mission Derek believed he'd accomplished by destroying Ryan's marriage and leaving him emotionally devastated, unaware that Ryan's inheritance would make him one of the most powerful people on Earth and a direct obstacle to consortium objectives that included things so horrifying Victoria had vomited twice while reading the files she'd stolen. When Victoria revealed that Derek had attempted to recruit her into consortium operations 3 weeks ago, offering her $50 million and a position of power if she could extract information about Eclipse Trust's activities from Ryan, she'd realized the entire trajectory of her adult life. Meeting Ryan, falling in love, growing distant, having an affair, divorcing, marrying Derek had been orchestrated by people who viewed human beings as chess pieces in games where millions of lives were the stakes. What would Ryan do now that he knew his mother's real enemy wasn't just market forces or rogue governments, but an organized network of sociopaths who'd been targeting him personally since before he even knew Eleanor Mitchell was ER Cross? How would Victoria process the realization that her ambitious climb toward success had actually been manipulation by people who'd identified her psychological vulnerabilities and exploited them to position her as a weapon against a man she'd once genuinely loved? And what would happen when Derek discovered that Victoria had betrayed the consortium by bringing evidence to Eclipse Trust? Because the consortium's response to betrayal, according to the documents Victoria had stolen, involved methods that made government black sites look merciful by comparison. Victoria Reeves Morrison sat in the Eclipse Trust conference room, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd divorced Ryan 6 years ago, but fear had a way of stripping away pretense and revealing raw humanity underneath. She'd lost weight, not the intentional kind that came from expensive personal trainers and controlled diets, but the stress-induced kind that made her clothes hang loose and her face look gaunt. Her hands shook as she pushed a tablet across the conference table toward Ryan, and her eyes carried the haunted quality of someone who'd seen behind curtains most people didn't know existed. "I need to start by saying I'm sorry," Victoria began, her voice cracking. "Not the performative sorry I should have given you 6 years ago, but genuine acknowledgement that I destroyed something real because I was too shallow and ambitious to recognize its value. You deserved better than what I gave you, Ryan. You deserved honesty and loyalty and someone who appreciated your character instead of dismissing it as weakness." Ryan studied his ex-wife carefully, flanked by Dr. Sterling and Marcus Thompson, with the rest of the Eclipse board watching via secure video feeds. 3 weeks ago, Victoria had sent an encrypted message to an Eclipse Trust contact address, requesting emergency meeting and claiming to have intelligence about hostile operations, targeting Ryan personally. The vetting process had confirmed Victoria's information was legitimate, or at least the portions they could verify independently checked out. but motivations remained unclear. "I appreciate the apology," Ryan said carefully, "but Dr. Sterling's message suggested you have information about consortium operations. Why don't we start there and we can address personal history later if necessary?" Victoria nodded, seeming relieved to focus on business rather than emotions. She activated the tablet and documents appeared on the room's main screens. Organizational charts, financial records, personnel files, operational summaries. The header on every document read, "The Consortium, confidential, unauthorized distribution punishable by termination." 3 weeks ago, Derek came home excited about a promotion, Victoria began, her voice steadying as she fell into narrative rhythm. "Not at his law firm. That partnership collapsed 2 years ago after ethics violations I now understand were deliberate sabotage. This was a different kind of promotion, with an organization he called the Consortium. He said they'd been observing him for years, evaluating his skills, and they wanted to offer him a position that would make his law career look like practice for the real game." She paused, swallowing hard. He was drinking. Derek drinks a lot now, more than he used to, and he was bragging about how he'd successfully completed his primary mission years ago, how he'd been recruited in college specifically to befriend you, Ryan, how the consortium had identified you as the son of E.R. Cross before you even knew who your mother really was, and they'd positioned Derek to monitor you, influence you, and if necessary, neutralize you as a threat. Marcus Thompson leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Neutralize how?" "Emotionally, primarily," Victoria replied, pulling up another document showing what appeared to be a psychological operations manual. "The consortium studies targets extensively. Family history, psychological profiles, vulnerabilities, relationships. They determined that Ryan's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his capacity for trust and genuine connection. If they could betray that trust severely enough, they believed they could break him emotionally, make him withdraw from relationships, become isolated and paranoid, easier to manipulate or simply neutralize through depression and dysfunction." Ryan felt cold spreading through his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "So Derek's friendship was always fake, from the beginning, in college?" "No," Victoria said quickly, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "That's the thing. Derek genuinely liked you at first. The consortium recruited him during sophomore year, after he and you had already become friends naturally. They capitalized on an existing relationship rather than creating one from scratch. But over time, as the consortium's conditioning took hold and Derek's character defects were encouraged rather than corrected, his feelings changed. By the time he pursued me, it was entirely operational. He didn't love me, Ryan. He didn't even particularly like me. I was a tool to hurt you." Dr. Sterling spoke for the first time, her voice cutting and precise. "How did you discover this information, Mrs. Morrison? These documents are clearly consortium classified material. What made Derek share them with you, and why did you decide to bring them to us?" Victoria pulled up another file, a recruitment offer with her name on it. "Derek got drunk and sloppy. He left his laptop open with these files accessible, and I started reading out of curiosity. When I saw my own name in a recruitment document, I realized I'd been as much a target as Ryan. The consortium had identified me in college too, profiled my ambition, my status seeking, my willingness to prioritize career over relationships. They'd arranged circumstances that made Ryan and me meet, facilitated our relationship, then created conditions that would drive us apart." She pulled up a document that made Ryan's blood run cold, a detailed compatibility assessment dated 6 months before Ryan had met Victoria, predicting with chilling accuracy exactly how their relationship would develop and deteriorate. They predicted I'd fall for Ryan initially because he represented everything I'd been taught to value: kindness, stability, integrity. Victoria continued, her voice breaking. But they also predicted I'd eventually resent those qualities. As my career advanced and I started measuring success by corporate metrics rather than human connection, they calculated that introducing Derek as an alternative, someone who embodied the ambition and ruthlessness I was learning to admire, would create conditions for an affair that would devastate Ryan and serve their objective of neutralizing him before he inherited Eleanor's empire. Raymond Kim interrupted via video feed, his tone skeptical. This level of social engineering seems extraordinarily resource-intensive for one target. Why would the consortium invest years of effort manipulating Ryan's personal relationships when there are simpler ways to neutralize threats? Because Ryan isn't the real target, Victoria replied, pulling up a document that made everyone in the room go silent. Eleanor Mitchell was. The consortium spent 40 years trying to stop her operations, but she was too careful, too strategic, too protected by Eclipse Trust's resources. So they shifted strategies. Instead of attacking Eleanor directly, they'd corrupt or destroy her heir, ensuring that when she died, her empire would fall apart or fall into incompetent hands. The document she'd displayed was a consortium strategic brief titled Project Succession, Neutralizing ER Cross Legacy. It outlined a multi-decade operation to identify Eleanor Mitchell's weaknesses, with particular focus on her son as a vulnerability that could be exploited. "Your mother knew," Victoria said, looking at Ryan with something between apology and awe. "The documents reference multiple failed attempts to compromise you because Eleanor had implemented countermeasures. The library career keeping you in modest circumstances where consortium financial manipulation wouldn't affect you significantly. The way she raised you outside wealthy social circles where consortium recruiters typically operated. Even her decision to keep you ignorant of her wealth. All of it was defensive strategy against consortium operations she knew were targeting you." Ryan thought about his mother's letter, about her agonizing over choices that caused him pain, about her treating his life as a proving ground. What he'd interpreted as manipulation for Eclipse Trust purposes had apparently also been protection against something worse, a hostile organization trying to corrupt or destroy him as a means of attacking his mother's work. "What is the consortium?" Ryan asked, his voice harder than he intended. "What do they want? Why target my mother specifically?" Victoria pulled up organizational documents that painted a picture more disturbing than anything Ryan had encountered in 3 years working with Eclipse Trust. The consortium wasn't just a shadow organization, it was a network of the world's most powerful sociopaths, people who'd recognized that traditional power structures limited their ability to pursue objectives democratic governments and even most authoritarian regimes would find unconscionable. Human trafficking on industrial scales, providing labor for operations too dangerous or illegal for legitimate workers. Weapons proliferation, creating conflicts that destabilized regions, making them easier to exploit for resources. Technology monopolization, ensuring that advances in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and quantum computing served consortium interests rather than broader humanity. Market manipulation that made Eclipse Trust's interventions look restrained by comparison, creating crashes that bankrupted millions while consortium members profited exponentially. But what made the consortium particularly dangerous was their recruitment methodology. They identified people with narcissistic and sociopathic tendencies, people who valued power over ethics, people who could rationalize any action as justified if it served their interests. Then they cultivated those people, put them in positions of authority across governments and corporations and institutions, and coordinated their actions to serve consortium objectives. "Your mother was their greatest threat," Victoria explained, showing documents detailing Eleanor's systematic disruption of consortium operations over 4 decades. Every trafficking network she dismantled, every weapons deal she sabotaged, every technology monopoly she prevented. It was all direct opposition to consortium objectives. They wanted her dead, but she was too careful. So they settled for trying to ensure her legacy died with her by corrupting you into someone who'd either join them or be too broken to effectively oppose them. The affair was the breaking point, Victoria continued, tears streaming freely now. Derek was instructed to pursue me, seduce me away from you, make the betrayal as public and humiliating as possible. The goal was to devastate you so completely that you'd withdraw from relationships permanently, making you emotionally isolated and vulnerable to consortium recruitment approaches. They have specialists who target broken people, offering them power and purpose when they're at their lowest points. Ryan remembered the months after Victoria left, the isolation, the depression, the questioning of everything he'd believed about relationships and trust. He'd recovered largely because of his mother's inheritance giving him purpose, because of Elena's genuine connection, providing new foundation for trust, because of his own resilience built through the hardships his mother had allowed him to experience. If any of those factors had been different, Ryan realized with cold certainty, he might have been vulnerable to exactly the kind of recruitment Victoria was describing, a consortium representative approaching him in the depths of despair, offering meaning and power and the ability to prevent others from hurting him. He couldn't say with absolute confidence he'd have rejected that approach. "Why are you telling us this now?" Dr. Sterling asked, her skepticism evident. "You've been married to Derek for 4 years. Why defect now? Why risk consortium retaliation by bringing us this intelligence?" Victoria's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Because Derek got drunk and told me what the consortium does to people who outlive their usefulness, what they did to other operatives who failed missions or became liabilities. The consortium doesn't do retirement packages, Dr. Sterling. They do permanent solutions. And Derek made very clear that I'd been useful but was becoming a liability, and my life expectancy was directly correlated to my continued value to consortium operations." She pulled up a final document, a termination order with her name on it, scheduled for execution in 6 weeks, pending final review of her recruitment potential. "They wanted to recruit me," Victoria said quietly. "Derek's promotion was contingent on bringing me into consortium operations, using my tech sector knowledge and my connection to Ryan as assets. But I'm not a sociopath regardless of what my behavior 6 years ago suggested. I can't participate in human trafficking and weapons proliferation and the other horrors these documents describe, so I stole what I could, erased my digital footprints as best as I could, given Raymond Kim taught me some security protocols during our marriage, and I came to the only people I thought might protect me, while also being positioned to actually fight the consortium." The room fell silent as everyone processed Victoria's intelligence and the implications of her defection. If her information was accurate, and the portions Eclipse could verify suggested it was, then everything Ryan had experienced for the past decade had been shaped by a hostile organization far more dangerous than he'd imagined. His friendship with Derek, cultivated and corrupted by consortium handlers, his marriage to Victoria arranged and destroyed as a psychological weapon, his inheritance intended to either corrupt him into consortium service or break him too thoroughly to oppose their operations. Even his current position with Eclipse Trust, possibly part of consortium plans in ways he couldn't yet recognize. "I need verification," Ryan said finally, looking at Dr. Sterling and Marcus Thompson. "Everything Victoria's telling us could be accurate, or it could be disinformation designed to manipulate Eclipse Trust operations. We need to verify her intelligence before making strategic decisions." Agreed, Dr. Sterling replied. Mrs. Morrison, you'll remain in protective custody while we verify your information. If it checks out, we'll discuss asylum and potentially recruitment. If it doesn't, or if we determine you're a consortium plant, consequences will be severe. Are those terms acceptable? Victoria nodded, looking exhausted and relieved simultaneously. I expected nothing less. I just want to survive this, Dr. Sterling. And maybe, if possible, I want to do something meaningful with whatever life I have left. I destroyed something good 6 years ago because I was shallow and foolish. If fighting the consortium gives me a chance to partially redeem that mistake, I'll take it. Ryan stood, preparing to leave the verification process to Eclipse's intelligence operatives, but Victoria caught his arm as he passed. Ryan, wait. There's something else. Something personal I need to tell you before you hear it from Derek or consortium sources. Ryan stopped, and Victoria's expression suggested whatever came next would hurt. I did love you, she said quietly. When we got married, when we were building our life together before things deteriorated, I genuinely loved you. The consortium arranged our meeting, but they didn't create my feelings. Those were real. And when I betrayed you with Derek, when I chose ambition over loyalty, I was making authentic choices based on my character flaws, not following consortium instructions. They created conditions, but I made the decisions. I need you to know that because you deserve to know that someone loved you genuinely, even if that someone was too flawed to honor that love appropriately. Ryan looked at his ex-wife, broken, terrified, seeking redemption or at least acknowledgement, and felt emotions he couldn't name. Anger at the betrayal that still stung even 6 years later. Sympathy for someone who'd been manipulated by forces she hadn't understood. Recognition that Victoria was offering something his mother had never quite managed. Honest acknowledgement of wrong done without rationalization or justification. I believe you, Ryan said finally, and for what it's worth, I forgive you, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying resentment is exhausting and I've got more important things to do with my energy than hate someone who hurt me because she was young and ambitious and flawed in ways most people are at some point. Victoria's tears intensified, but Ryan left before either of them could say anything else. There would be time for processing personal history later if Victoria's intelligence proved accurate and she survived whatever came next. Right now, Ryan needed to focus on the revelation that his entire adult life had been a battlefield, in a war he hadn't known he was fighting, waged by enemies he hadn't known existed, using weapons that looked like friendships and love but were actually sophisticated psychological operations designed to destroy him. The consortium had failed to break him, but they'd come disturbingly close, and now that Ryan knew they existed, the real war could finally begin. Part 2. Verification and Revelation. The next 72 hours were among the most intense of Ryan's life, but Eclipse Trust's intelligence apparatus proved why his mother had spent 40 years building it. Victoria's documents were subjected to forensic analysis that verified their authenticity. The digital signatures matched known consortium encryption protocols that Eclipse had been tracking for years without understanding their full significance. The operational details aligned with unexplained events Eclipse had investigated without connecting them to coordinated hostile action. But the real verification came from human intelligence. Eclipse operatives embedded in organizations, Victoria's documents identified as consortium fronts, confirmed details that Victoria couldn't have fabricated. Names matched actual people. Locations aligned with properties Eclipse had flagged as suspicious. Financial flows connected to transactions Eclipse had monitored without understanding their ultimate purpose. She's telling the truth, Marcus Thompson reported during an emergency board meeting 3 days after Victoria's defection. At least everything we can independently verify checks out. The consortium is real. Derek Morrison is definitely an operative, and Victoria appears to be a genuine defector rather than a plant. "What's our exposure?" Dr. Sterling asked, and her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be bad. Raymond Kim pulled up analysis that made everyone's expressions darken. Substantial. Victoria's documents identify 47 individuals in positions of authority across government, finance, and technology who are confirmed or suspected consortium operatives. 3 of them have direct relationships with Eclipse Trust board members or key personnel. We've been compromised at multiple levels without recognizing it. The realization that the consortium had infiltrated Eclipse's operations, not deeply enough to compromise core functions, but enough to monitor activities and potentially sabotage specific operations, sent shockwaves through the board. "We need to purge," Jennifer Zhao said flatly. "Anyone with consortium connections gets removed from positions of authority immediately, regardless of their apparent loyalty or the operational disruption it causes." "That plays into their hands," David O'Brien countered. "Massive purges create chaos and inefficiency, which serves consortium interests by weakening us exactly when we need to be strongest. We need surgical precision, not paranoid overreaction." The debate continued for hours, with Ryan mostly listening, absorbing the reality that Eclipse Trust, which he'd spent 3 years reforming and 3 more years reluctantly accepting as necessary, had been infiltrated by an organization that made Eclipse's ethical compromises look positively humanitarian by comparison. But what struck Ryan most wasn't the consortium's infiltration of Eclipse. It was the realization that his mother had been fighting this war for 40 years, had known about consortium operations targeting Ryan specifically, and had designed her entire parenting strategy around protecting him while also preparing him to eventually fight enemies she couldn't defeat alone. Every hardship she'd allowed him to experience, every test she'd designed, every manipulation he'd resented, all of it had been not just evaluation for Eclipse Trust membership, but also preparation for a war against people who viewed human beings as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. His mother had known the consortium would target him. She'd known Derek Morrison was likely compromised or would be recruited eventually. She'd possibly even known Victoria would be manipulated into betraying him, and she'd allowed it all to happen because preventing it would have made Ryan soft, naive, vulnerable to worse manipulation later. The cruelty of that calculation was staggering, but so was the strategic brilliance. Ryan had survived betrayal and emerged stronger, more cautious, more capable of recognizing manipulation. If his mother had protected him from heartbreak, he'd be exactly the kind of trusting person the consortium could easily deceive and destroy. "We need to go after them," Ryan said suddenly, interrupting the board's tactical debate. "Not defensively, not reactively, but proactively. The consortium has been attacking us for decades while we didn't even know they existed as a unified organization. Now we know. We have their documents, their organizational structure, their operational methods. We need to dismantle them systematically before they regroup and adapt to our newfound awareness." Dr. Sterling looked at Ryan with something between respect and concern. "That's a significant escalation, Ryan. The consortium isn't like the threats Eclipse normally manages. They're not a rogue government or a single bad actor. They're a network spanning dozens of countries, hundreds of operatives, billions of dollars in resources. Taking them on directly could trigger consequences we can't fully anticipate." "My mother spent 40 years fighting them," Ryan replied, his voice hard with determination. "She disrupted their operations, saved millions of people from trafficking and exploitation, prevented technologies from falling under their control, but she fought defensively, reactively, because she was protecting me and couldn't risk full confrontation that might expose me to retaliation. I don't have that constraint anymore. The consortium already knows who I am, has already tried to destroy me, has already positioned operatives in my life. We're at war whether we acknowledge it or not. I'm voting to acknowledge it and fight accordingly." The board members exchanged glances, and Ryan saw the decision forming. They'd been waiting for this, for Ryan to embrace the ruthlessness that Eclipse Trust operations sometimes required, for him to prioritize strategic objectives over ethical constraints, for him to become what his mother had been, a guardian willing to make impossible choices to protect people who'd never know they needed protecting. It was exactly what Ryan had feared when he joined Eclipse 3 years ago, that the organization would corrupt him into someone who rationalized anything in service of larger purposes. But it was also what his mother had prepared him for, the willingness to fight evil even when fighting required becoming something darker than he'd wanted to be. All in favor of initiating offensive operations against consortium networks? Dr. Sterling called for a vote, and every board member's hand went up, including Ryan's. The war was official now, and Ryan Mitchell, former librarian, betrayed husband, reluctant billionaire, and now apparently resistance leader against a global network of sociopaths, had just committed Eclipse Trust's resources to a fight that would define the rest of his life. Part 3. The hunter becomes hunted. Derek Morrison realized something was wrong when his consortium handler missed their scheduled contact for the first time in 8 years, but by then, Eclipse Trust's offensive operations were already in motion. Ryan had insisted on one condition for the anti-consortium campaign. Derek would be his personal responsibility, not because Ryan wanted revenge, though he'd be lying if he claimed revenge wasn't a factor, but because Derek represented something specific. He was the friend who'd betrayed, the operative who'd corrupted genuine relationship into weapon, the person who embodied everything Ryan had learned to recognize and oppose. Taking down Derek wouldn't just neutralize a consortium operative. It would be Ryan's declaration that he'd survived the breaking they'd intended, had emerged stronger, and was coming for everyone who'd underestimated him. Eclipse's intelligence operatives had tracked Derek's movements for 2 weeks, building a pattern of life analysis that revealed how thoroughly Derek's existence had become consortium operational theater. His law office was a front for money laundering. His apartment was a safe house for operatives moving through Boston. His social circle consisted entirely of consortium members or recruitment targets. Even his relationship with Victoria had been maintained primarily as cover, though Ryan suspected Derek had genuinely enjoyed the power dynamics of corrupting someone else's wife. The approach was designed carefully, not a kidnapping or confrontation, but an invitation Derek couldn't refuse without revealing he understood its significance. A message from a supposed consortium superior requesting urgent meeting at a location Derek would recognize as authentic based on protocols Victoria's documents had revealed. Derek arrived at the designated meeting point, a private floor of a building that Eclipse controlled, but that Consortium believed was neutral ground, and walked directly into a room where Ryan waited alone. The moment of recognition was everything Ryan had anticipated. Derek's expression shifted from professional courtesy to shock, to fear, to calculation within seconds, his operative training engaging as he assessed the situation and potential responses. "Hello, Derek," Ryan said quietly, gesturing to a chair across from him. "Sit down, we have things to discuss." "Ryan, I don't know what Victoria told you, but—" "Victoria told me everything," Ryan interrupted, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made Derek stop mid-sentence. "The consortium, your recruitment in college, your mission to befriend me and eventually betray me, Your 8 years of operational work using our friendship as cover. She gave us documents, protocols, operational summaries. We've spent 2 weeks verifying her intelligence, and it all checks out. So please don't insult us both by pretending you're still my friend who made some mistakes. You're an operative who targeted me, and now you're compromised. Derek's professional facade cracked, and something uglier showed through. Contempt mixed with frustration that his long-term operation had been exposed by his own wife's defection. You think you've won? You think knowing about the consortium changes anything? We're everywhere, Ryan. Government, corporations, technology companies, financial institutions. We're the people who actually run things while democratically elected officials play at leadership. Your mother fought us for 40 years and barely slowed us down. What makes you think you can do better? Because my mother fought defensively, Ryan replied. She protected her operations, disrupted your networks when they intersected with her work, but she never went after the consortium directly because she was protecting me. I don't have that constraint. You already tried to break me and failed. Now I'm coming for all of you. Derek laughed, the same sharp, cruel laugh Ryan remembered from the funeral 6 years ago, from the divorce proceedings, from countless moments when Derek had enjoyed his perceived superiority. You're still that naive librarian, aren't you? You think wealth and Eclipse Trust make you powerful, but you don't understand power at all. The consortium doesn't play by rules. We don't have ethics constraints or democratic accountability. We win because we're willing to do whatever it takes while people like you agonize over whether your methods are justified. You're right, Ryan agreed, and his calm acceptance clearly surprised Derek. I do agonize over methods. I do question whether ends justify means. I do lose sleep over decisions that prioritize strategic objectives over individual rights. But you know what? That agonizing, that questioning, that doubt, it's what separates me from you. I make hard choices while hating that I have to make them. You make hard choices while enjoying the power they give you. And that difference means when this is over, I'll still be someone who can live with himself, while you'll be whatever you've become. Ryan stood and walked to the window, looking out over Boston while Derek sat in forced calm that was beginning to crack. Here's what's going to happen. Eclipse Trust is dismantling consortium networks systematically. We're exposing your operatives, shutting down your funding sources, dismantling your operations piece by piece. We have Victoria's documents, but we also have something better. We have legitimacy. When we expose what the consortium does, people will believe us because we're not operating entirely in shadows like you do. We have public faces, legal structures, resources that can withstand scrutiny. You'll never expose all of us, Derek said, but his confidence was wavering. We're too distributed, too embedded. You take down one operative, we recruit 2 more. You shut down one operation, we open 3 elsewhere. You can't win a war of attrition against an organization that's been building power for 50 years. Maybe not, Ryan conceded. But I can make your operations expensive, difficult, and dangerous enough that consortium leadership starts questioning whether continuing is worth the cost. Your organization runs on rational calculation of risks versus benefits. What happens when the risks start outweighing the benefits? When operatives start defecting like Victoria because they realize the consortium terminates liabilities? When recruitment becomes harder because targets understand what they're actually joining? Ryan turned from the window to face Derek directly. You're a test case, Derek. What we do with you sends a message to every other consortium operative about what happens when you're exposed. So here's your choice. Cooperate with Eclipse Trust, provide intelligence about operations and personnel. Help us dismantle networks you've been part of building. Or refuse, and we turn you over to law enforcement with documentation of every crime you've committed over 8 years. The money laundering, the fraud, the conspiracy. maybe even accomplice liability for the trafficking and weapons deals your organization facilitates. Derek's laugh was bitter now, edged with desperation. You think prison scares me? The consortium owns corrections officials, judges, prosecutors. They'd either get me out or make sure I didn't survive long enough to testify. You're offering me a choice between cooperation that gets me killed or legal consequences that get me killed. Some choice. Or there's door number 3, Ryan said, and now his voice carried an edge Victoria's testimony had warned about, the capacity for strategic cruelty that Ryan had developed over 6 years managing Eclipse operations. You disappear, not killed, not imprisoned, just removed from the board. New identity, new location, enough money to live comfortably but not luxuriously, and Eclipse protection from consortium retaliation as long as you never contact anyone from your former life. You'd be losing everything, your identity, your connections, your accumulated power, but you'd be alive and free. Derek stared at Ryan, clearly trying to assess whether the offer was genuine or manipulation. Why? Why offer me mercy after everything I did to you? Because you're right that I agonize over methods, Ryan replied honestly. Because killing you or imprisoning you serves emotional satisfaction but doesn't serve strategic objectives, as well as turning you into an example of alternative paths. And because, Ryan paused, choosing words carefully, because my mother spent her entire life fighting people who treated human beings as disposable resources. I won't become what she opposed by treating you the same way the consortium would. You're a person who made terrible choices, Derek. That doesn't make you irredeemable, just compromised. I'd rather offer you a chance to be something better than simply eliminate you as a threat. The words hung in the air between them. Mercy offered from position of power. Forgiveness extended not because it was deserved, but because the alternative was becoming exactly what they were fighting. Derek was quiet for a long time, and Ryan watched emotions play across his former friend's face. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice hollow. You know what the worst part is? You're still the same person I met in college, still genuinely kind despite having every reason to be cruel, still offering people redemption they don't deserve. The consortium was right that you were dangerous, but they were wrong about why. They thought your capacity for trust made you vulnerable. They didn't realize it was actually your greatest strength, the ability to keep being decent even after people prove they don't deserve decency. So what's your choice? Ryan asked. Derek closed his eyes, and when he opened them, something had shifted. Cooperation. I'll give you everything I know about consortium operations, personnel, networks. I'll help you dismantle what I helped build. And then I'll take your door number 3 and disappear, because honestly, I'm tired. 8 years of operational work, constant deception, living a life where every relationship is transactional. I'm exhausted, Ryan. Maybe disappearing is exactly what I need. Ryan nodded, feeling something complex. Not quite satisfaction, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps acceptance that people were complicated and that his choice to offer mercy instead of revenge was about his own values rather than Derek's worth. Eclipse operatives will debrief you extensively, Ryan said. It won't be comfortable, and if we determine you're providing false intelligence or holding back critical information, consequences will be immediate. But if you cooperate genuinely, we'll honor our commitment. You'll get to restart somewhere far from Boston, far from the consortium, far from everything you've been. Maybe you'll find out who you could have been if they'd never recruited you. Derek laughed softly, but it lacked his usual cruelty. You're giving me the chance to be the person I could have been if I'd stayed your friend instead of becoming your enemy. That's either incredibly generous or incredibly naive. Maybe both, Ryan agreed. But I'd rather be naive and principled than cynical and corrupt. My mother taught me that even while she was manipulating my life in ways I'm still processing. Character matters more than tactics, Derek. You forgot that somewhere along the way. Maybe exile will help you remember. Derek stood, and for a moment, the two men who'd been friends in college, who'd studied together and dreamed together before betrayal and conspiracy and organizational warfare had transformed them into enemies, looked at each other with something like mutual recognition of paths diverged. For what it's worth, Derek said quietly, I did like you, before the consortium, before the operational objectives, before everything got complicated. I genuinely liked you, Ryan. You were a good friend, and I was a better person when we were just two college students figuring out life together. I'm sorry I let that version of myself get corrupted into what I became. I know, Ryan replied. That's why I'm offering you this chance. Not for the person you became, but for the person you used to be, who might still exist somewhere under all the operational conditioning. Derek left with Eclipse operatives heading toward debriefing that would last weeks and transform him from consortium operative into intelligence asset that would help dismantle networks he'd spent 8 years building. Ryan stayed in the room after Derek departed, looking out over the city and processing the conversation. He'd offered mercy to someone who'd betrayed him catastrophically, had chosen strategic compassion over emotional revenge, had prioritized his own values over satisfaction of seeing Derek suffer. His mother would be proud, Ryan thought. Or maybe she'd be concerned that he was still too soft for the work Eclipse required. He'd never know for certain, but he could make choices that honored the best parts of what she'd taught him, while rejecting the manipulative methods she'd employed. The consortium war was just beginning, and Derek's cooperation would provide intelligence that would devastate their operations. But the real victory wasn't strategic, it was personal. Ryan had faced the friend who'd betrayed him, the operative who'd tried to break him, and instead of becoming bitter or cruel, he'd stayed principled and compassionate. If that made him naive, so be it. He'd rather be naive and decent than effective and corrupted. Epilogue. 6 months forward. 6 months after Derek's defection and cooperation, Eclipse Trust's offensive against the consortium had dismantled 43 operational networks, exposed 67 operatives, and disrupted billions in illicit financial flows. But the cost had been severe and personal in ways Ryan hadn't fully anticipated. Victoria had survived her debriefing and had been offered a position with Eclipse Trust's Technology Security Division, working under Raymond Kim to identify and counter consortium digital operations. Her knowledge of tech sector vulnerabilities combined with her insider understanding of consortium recruitment methods made her valuable, though Ryan maintained professional distance that acknowledged their shared history without reopening wounds that had finally started healing. Derek had fulfilled his cooperation agreement and had disappeared into a new identity in rural Montana, completely cut off from his former life, living modestly and, according to Eclipse monitors assigned to verify he wasn't re-establishing consortium contact, apparently embracing the anonymity and simplicity he'd claimed to want. Whether he was genuinely reforming or simply biding time, Ryan couldn't know, but the intelligence Derek had provided had proven invaluable. The consortium had retaliated viciously against Eclipse operations, but in ways that revealed their desperation. 3 Eclipse properties had been targeted with arson, causing millions in damage but no casualties due to security protocols Ryan's mother had implemented decades ago. 5 Eclipse operatives had survived assassination attempts that would have succeeded if not for heightened security and threat awareness. The consortium had tried to expose Eclipse Trust's existence through media manipulation, but Eclipse's public-facing charitable foundations provided enough legitimate cover that conspiracy theories gained little traction. But the real war was being fought in shadows. Financial markets where Eclipse and consortium proxies maneuvered for advantage. Technology sectors where both organizations competed for influence over emerging innovations. Intelligence networks where each side tried to compromise the other's operations while protecting their own. Ryan found himself spending 12-hour days managing Eclipse's response to consortium actions, making decisions that would have horrified him 6 years ago when he'd first learned about his mother's secret life. He'd authorized operations that technically violated laws, had approved intelligence gathering that infringed on privacy, had made calculations about acceptable collateral damage that kept him awake at night. He was becoming his mother, Ryan recognized, brilliant and strategic and effective at preventing catastrophes, but also isolated, secretive, carrying burdens that transformed him into someone he barely recognized. Elena noticed, of course. She always noticed. "You're losing yourself," she said one evening when Ryan came home exhausted from another crisis management session. "You're so focused on fighting the consortium that you're forgetting why you're fighting them. You're becoming exactly what they are. People who rationalize anything in service of objectives. They've convinced themselves justify any method." Ryan wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She was right. The war with the consortium had consumed him, had transformed Eclipse Trust from an organization he'd reluctantly accepted as necessary into a weapon he wielded with increasing comfort and decreasing hesitation. "What's the alternative?" Ryan asked, genuine uncertainty in his voice. "The consortium traffics human beings, proliferates weapons that kill thousands, monopolizes technologies that could be used to enslave populations. If I don't fight them, who does? If Eclipse Trust doesn't make these hard choices, what organization will?" "Maybe no organization should," Elena replied. "Maybe some fights can't be won by becoming what you're fighting against. Maybe the real victory isn't dismantling the consortium. Maybe it's refusing to become them, even when refusing means accepting that you can't prevent every horror they perpetrate." The conversation had ended without resolution, and Ryan had returned to work the next day, facing the same impossible choices with the same inadequate ethical frameworks. But Elena's words haunted him, especially during a board meeting where Dr. Sterling proposed an operation that would deliberately crash markets in 3 countries to prevent consortium operatives from exploiting those markets' instability. The operation would prevent the consortium from funding their operations through speculation, but it would also impoverish millions of innocent people who'd lose savings and pensions in the crashes. Collateral damage, Dr. Sterling called it, regrettable but necessary to prevent worse outcomes. Ryan had heard his mother use similar language in her journals. He'd used similar language himself over the past 6 months. But hearing it now, after Elena's warning, Ryan recognized the rationalization for what it was, the slow corruption of principles in service of objectives that seemed important enough to justify anything. "No," Ryan said, and the board turned to look at him with surprise. "We're not crashing those markets. We're not impoverishing millions to hurt the consortium financially. That's exactly the kind of calculus that makes us no better than them. We find another way to disrupt their funding, or we accept that some fights we can't win without becoming what we oppose." "That's naive," Marcus Thompson said, but his tone was more sad than contemptuous. "The consortium doesn't constrain themselves with ethics. If we fight with one hand tied behind our backs, while they use every tactic available, we'll lose." "Maybe," Ryan agreed, "but maybe some losses are better than some victories. Maybe preserving our principles matters more than winning every battle. My mother fought the consortium for 40 years without becoming them. She made hard choices, but she had lines she wouldn't cross. I'm voting to maintain those lines even if it means accepting operational disadvantages." The board debated for hours, but ultimately Ryan's position prevailed. Barely. The market crash operation was scrapped, and Eclipse pursued alternative strategies to disrupt consortium funding that were less efficient but more ethical. That night, Ryan sat in his mother's command center, reading her journals again, looking for wisdom about how she'd maintained her principles while fighting an organization that had none. He found an entry from 2009, written a year after the financial crisis, that seemed to speak directly to his current situation. The consortium wanted me to amplify the 2008 crash, to let markets collapse entirely so they could buy assets at pennies on the dollar and consolidate power. I refused, even though refusing meant using Eclipse resources to stabilize markets and foregoing opportunities for acquisition that would have tripled our holdings. Marcus called me naive. Jennifer said I was choosing abstract ethics over concrete strategic advantage. But I remember who I'm fighting for, not abstract humanity or geopolitical stability, but actual people who'd suffer if I prioritized victory over principle. Ryan is 8 now, learning multiplication tables and struggling with them like I did at his age. He doesn't know I spent last night preventing economic collapse that would have destroyed his future. He just knows his mom helps him with homework and makes breakfast and reads him stories before bed. That mundane domesticity is what I'm protecting, the ability for normal people to live normal lives without knowing about shadow wars and organizational battles and impossible choices. If fighting the consortium requires me to become them, then what's the point? I'll have won the war but lost the reason for fighting. Better to fight imperfectly while maintaining principles than to fight perfectly while abandoning them. Ryan closed the journal, tears burning his eyes as he understood his mother's choices with new clarity. She'd fought the consortium for 40 years, not by matching their ruthlessness, but by refusing to match it. She'd made hard choices while maintaining lines she wouldn't cross. She'd won some battles and lost others, but she'd remained fundamentally herself. Strategic and effective, but also principled and constrained by values that transcended tactical advantages. That was the real inheritance, Ryan understood. Not the $90 billion in real estate or the $47 billion in Eclipse Trust assets, but the example of how to wield power without letting power corrupt you, how to fight evil without becoming evil, how to make impossible choices while maintaining the principles that made you worth rooting for. The consortium war would continue. Eclipse Trust would win some operations and lose others. Ryan would make difficult decisions that kept him awake at night, but he'd make those decisions while refusing to cross lines that separated him from the enemies he fought, while maintaining the character his mother had spent 33 years developing, while staying true to the person he'd been when he was just a librarian who helped people discover knowledge and believed in human goodness despite evidence of human cruelty. 6 years after inheriting his mother's empire, 6 months after declaring war on the consortium, Ryan Mitchell finally understood what his mother had been preparing him for. Not victory over specific enemies, but the lifelong struggle to remain decent while wielding enormous power, to stay principled while making pragmatic choices, to fight necessary battles without losing yourself in the fighting. It was harder than any organizational challenge, more complex than any strategic operation, more important than any financial objective, and Ryan committed himself to that struggle, honoring his mother's legacy not by perfectly managing the empire she'd built, but by imperfectly maintaining the values she'd taught him. Values that made the empire worth having and the power worth wielding and the wars worth fighting. The shadow legacy continued, passed from mother to son, but transformed by Ryan's insistence on fighting differently than his enemies, on winning while staying principled, on using power for good while accepting the limitations that ethics imposed. Eleanor Mitchell had fought the consortium for 40 years, Ryan would fight them for however many years remained to him, but he'd fight as himself, flawed, uncertain, occasionally naive, but fundamentally decent and committed to staying that way, regardless of tactical disadvantages. That was the real victory, he understood now. Not defeating the consortium entirely, but refusing to become them in the process of fighting them. And as Ryan looked at his mother's photograph on the wall, young and idealistic, then older and weighted with experience but always recognizably herself, he made a silent promise. "I'll continue your work, Mom, but I'll do it my way, fighting smart but also fighting clean, using power but also constraining it, making hard choices while questioning whether they're justified, being strategic without being cynical, winning when possible but accepting some losses rather than abandoning principles. You prepared me for this. Now watch me honor your legacy by improving on it, by learning from your wisdom while also learning from your mistakes, by being your successor while also being my own person. The war continues, but so do I. Imperfectly principled, questionably effective, but genuinely trying to be someone worth the inheritance you gave me." Ryan Mitchell stood in the newly dedicated Eleanor Mitchell Memorial Library in downtown Boston, watching children explore the 3-story space filled with books, technology, learning pods, and quiet reading corners that his mother would have loved. But the real reason for his presence wasn't the dedication ceremony. It was the encrypted message he'd received at 6:47 a.m. from a consortium operative requesting defection and claiming to have evidence that the consortium's leadership had always known Eleanor Mitchell would eventually win their decades-long war, but they'd needed a worthy opponent to justify their existence. And now that Ryan had spent 10 years systematically dismantling their networks, they were ready to negotiate terms of surrender that would transform both organizations into something neither had imagined possible. 10 years, a decade since his mother's death, since discovering Cross Holdings, since learning about Eclipse Trust and the consortium and shadow wars fought in margins between what democratic governments could acknowledge and what they secretly depended upon. Ryan was 43 now, and the years showed in the gray threading through his hair, the lines around his eyes from too many sleepless nights, the weariness that came from carrying responsibilities that affected billions of people who'd never know his name. But he'd survived, had thrived in complicated ways, and had managed something his mother never quite achieved: balance between the shadow work and genuine human connection. Elena stood beside him at the dedication, their daughter Sophie, age 6 and already showing disturbing signs of her grandmother's strategic intelligence, tugging at Ryan's hand and asking when she could explore the children's section. Their son Marcus, named after Marcus Thompson, who'd retired from Eclipse Trust 3 years ago but remained Ryan's trusted advisor, was 2 and currently napping in Elena's arms, blissfully unaware that his father was one of the world's most powerful people. Ryan had made different choices than his mother about how to raise children with knowledge of wealth and shadow organizations. Sophie knew her father was very wealthy and did important work helping people, but she didn't know specifics about Eclipse Trust or the consortium or the decade-long war Ryan had been prosecuting. When she was older, maybe 15, maybe 18, maybe never, Ryan would decide how much to reveal about the family business and the impossible choices it required. But unlike his mother, Ryan had committed to letting Sophie choose her own path completely. If she wanted to join Eclipse Trust eventually, he'd train her. If she wanted to be a doctor or artist or teacher or anything else, he'd support that equally. The manipulation and testing his mother had employed, however well-intentioned, ended with Ryan's generation. "Beautiful space," Elena said quietly, scanning the library that had cost $47 million, but would serve Boston's communities for generations. "Your mother would be proud. 14 libraries across 6 states, all serving populations that were underserved by existing systems. That's real legacy, Ryan, more lasting than financial empires or shadow organizations. Ryan squeezed her hand, grateful for the woman who'd chosen to stay with him. Through everything, the consortium war, the eclipse operations that sometimes required Ryan to be absent for weeks, the constant security precautions, the knowledge that their family was perpetually targeted by people who viewed assassination as legitimate business tactic. Elena had insisted on one condition for staying married: transparency about Ryan's work. No more secrets, no more compartmentalization, no more coming home exhausted from operations he couldn't discuss. Ryan had agreed, which meant Elena knew everything about Eclipse Trust, about consortium operations, about the morally ambiguous decisions Ryan made regularly. She'd become his conscience, the voice reminding him when his justifications started sounding like rationalizations, when his strategic thinking started overriding his ethical constraints, when he risked becoming exactly what he'd fought against. "Speech in 5 minutes, Mr. Mitchell," an aide whispered, and Ryan nodded, preparing to address the gathered crowd. City officials, library advocates, community leaders, and media covering the dedication of a facility that would bear his mother's name and serve her values. But first, he checked the encrypted message again, rereading words that suggested the consortium war might finally be approaching endgame. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I've served as Consortium Director of Strategic Operations for the past 12 years. I'm writing to request defection and to propose something unprecedented: negotiated surrender rather than continued conflict." Over the past 10 years, Eclipse Trust operations have dismantled 73% of consortium networks, exposed 89% of our operatives, and disrupted approximately $340 billion in illicit operations we'd spent 50 years building. Your mother wounded us severely over 4 decades, but you've effectively destroyed us over 1. But here's what you don't know. The consortium's original founders in 1972 weren't purely sociopathic empire builders. They were game theorists who believed democratic systems needed adversarial pressure to evolve and improve. They created the consortium as a controlled opposition, dangerous enough to force democratic institutions to become stronger, sophisticated enough to identify and exploit systemic vulnerabilities, but ultimately designed to be defeatable by someone with sufficient resources, intelligence, and principles. Your mother was identified in 1987 as potentially that someone. Everything the consortium did for 40 years, every operation, every recruitment, every strategic objective was designed to create pressure that would force her to build Eclipse Trust into an organization capable of defeating us. We targeted her because we needed her to become powerful enough to win. And then she died before completing that work, leaving you to inherit not just her wealth, but her mission. Your response to betrayal, your navigation of Eclipse Trust's moral complexities, your decade-long war against consortium operations, all of it confirmed what our founders suspected. Democratic systems, when defended by principled people with adequate resources, can defeat authoritarian alternatives. We've proven the hypothesis our founders wanted to test. Now it's time to end the experiment. I'm proposing this. The consortium surrenders operationally. We provide complete intelligence on remaining networks, personnel, and assets. We cooperate with legal prosecution of operatives who committed crimes beyond the acceptable parameters of our opposition role. And in exchange, Eclipse Trust commits to absorbing the consortium's legitimate strategic functions, the market stabilization, the conflict prevention, the technology oversight, but doing so with the transparent accountability and democratic principles you've spent 10 years insisting upon. Transform both organizations into something new. something that serves the functions shadow organizations were created to serve, but with oversight, accountability, and ethical constraints that prevent the corruption the consortium embodied. I have documentation proving everything I've claimed about the consortium's original purpose. I have evidence that will revolutionize your understanding of the war you've been fighting. And I have proposal frameworks for what comes next. Will you meet with me? Will you consider that victory might not be destroying the consortium, but transforming both of our organizations into something better than either could be separately? The choice, as always, is yours. Dr. Sarah Chen, Consortium Director of Strategic Operations. Ryan had read the message 17 times since receiving it, analyzing every word for deception, manipulation, or hidden agenda. Eclipse Trust's intelligence analysts had spent 6 hours vetting Dr. Chen's identity and claims, confirming she was indeed a senior consortium official and that her communication was legitimate rather than disinformation. But the central claim that the consortium had been designed as controlled opposition to strengthen democratic systems seemed too convenient, too self-serving, too much like rationalization designed to reframe defeat as victory. Or was it? Ryan thought about game theory, about how systems evolved through adversarial pressure, about how his mother's Eclipse Trust had indeed become more sophisticated and effective through fighting the consortium than it might have become without that opposition. "You're thinking about the message," Elena said quietly, reading his expression. "The consortium surrender proposal." Ryan nodded. Elena knew about Dr. Chen's communication. Transparency meant Ryan discussed strategic decisions with his wife before making them, getting her perspective on ethical dimensions he might be too compromised to see clearly. "What's your instinct?" Elena asked. "That it's manipulation," Ryan replied. "That the consortium is trying to reframe their defeat as deliberate evolution, trying to negotiate surrender terms that let them preserve power under different organizational structure. That Dr. Chen is offering exactly what I'd want to hear: transformation rather than destruction, redemption rather than annihilation, because she's studied my psychological profile and knows how I think." "But," Elena prompted, hearing the uncertainty Ryan was trying to hide. "But what if it's true?" Ryan said quietly. "What if the consortium really was designed as opposition that democratic systems needed to overcome? What if the past 10 years weren't just war, but also tests that we've now passed? What if Dr. Chen is offering genuine transformation rather than disguised surrender?" Elena was quiet for a moment, watching Sophie play with other children near the library entrance. "Here's what I think. The consortium has trafficked human beings, proliferated weapons that killed thousands, monopolized technologies for their own benefit. Even if their original purpose was noble opposition, they became exactly what they were supposedly designed to oppose. You can't redeem that with game theory justifications. So I should refuse the meeting, continue operations until the consortium is completely destroyed?" "I didn't say that," Elena corrected. "I said you can't redeem the consortium's crimes with justifications, but you can potentially transform their remaining infrastructure into something that serves legitimate purposes. Meet with Dr. Chen, hear her evidence, evaluate her proposal, but don't let her rewrite history to make the consortium's horrors seem like necessary evolution. They did terrible things. Accept their surrender if it's genuine. Absorb their assets if it's strategic, but don't absolve them of accountability for decades of atrocities." Ryan pulled Elena close, grateful for her moral clarity that cut through strategic complexity. "I love you. You know that, right? I couldn't do any of this without you keeping me honest." "I know," Elena replied, kissing him softly. "Now go give your speech about libraries and literacy and your mother's legacy. The shadow organization warfare can wait until after the dedication." Ryan walked to the podium, looking out at hundreds of people gathered to celebrate the library's opening. Most of them knew him as a wealthy philanthropist, maybe recognized his name from business news about real estate holdings, but had no idea about Eclipse Trust or consortium wars or the decade he'd spent fighting battles they'd never know happened. That anonymity felt like blessing rather than burden. These people lived normal lives, raised families, pursued happiness, contributed to their communities, all the things his mother had fought to protect. All the things Ryan had spent 10 years ensuring they could continue doing without knowing how close certain catastrophes had come to destroying their worlds. "Thank you for joining us today," Ryan began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This library bears my mother's name, but it represents her values, belief that knowledge should be accessible to everyone, that education transforms lives, that communities thrive when people can learn and grow and discover their potential." He spoke about literacy programs the library would host, about technology access for underserved populations, about partnerships with schools and community organizations. He spoke about his mother's 42 years working as librarian, her love of books, her commitment to helping people discover knowledge. He didn't speak about cross-holdings or Eclipse Trust or shadow wars. He didn't mention that the library's funding came from fortune built through real estate empire his mother had managed, while maintaining cover as modest librarian. He didn't reveal that this building, like 14 others across 6 states, was part of legacy far more complex than simple philanthropy. But as Ryan spoke, watching Elena and Sophie and Marcus in the front row, seeing Victoria working security detail at the event's perimeter, she'd proven invaluable to Eclipse operations and had earned Ryan's professional respect, if not personal forgiveness. Knowing that Derek was somewhere in Montana, living quiet life far from shadow organization warfare, Ryan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not complete peace. He'd never have that while Eclipse Trust existed and while responsibilities weighed on him, but temporary peace. Moment of clarity where the purpose of his work felt tangible and real, rather than abstract and morally ambiguous. His mother had built library systems, while secretly managing global real estate empire and fighting shadow organization that trafficked humans and proliferated weapons. Ryan was continuing that work, managing the visible empire, prosecuting the shadow war, but also creating spaces like this library where normal people could pursue normal dreams without knowing about battles fought to protect their ability to do so. The speech concluded to applause, and Ryan cut the ribbon, officially opening the Eleanor Mitchell Memorial Library. Children rushed inside to explore, and Ryan followed, watching Sophie discover the children's section with delight that reminded him of his own childhood, discovering books at the Westfield Library where his mother had worked. His phone buzzed with message from Dr. Sterling. Dr. Chen's evidence checks out. The consortium surrender proposal appears legitimate. Board meeting tomorrow to discuss terms. Your vote will likely be decisive. Ryan acknowledged the message but didn't let it distract from Sophie's excited explanations about interactive story pods and digital reading programs and everything else she was discovering. This moment, watching his daughter experience joy in space, created to honor his mother's memory, mattered more than strategic decisions about shadow organization surrender. The consortium war would end eventually, Ryan knew, either through complete destruction of remaining networks or through negotiated transformation that absorbed their infrastructure into Eclipse operations with accountability and oversight. Either outcome would be victory of sorts. But the real victory was this. Ryan had fought decade-long war against organization designed to exploit and enslave humanity, had made impossible choices and moral compromises, had wielded enormous power with questionable ethics, and he'd emerged still fundamentally himself, still principled enough to question his decisions, still compassionate enough to offer mercy when destruction would be easier, still committed to building things like libraries that served communities rather than just accumulating power for its own sake. His mother had prepared him for shadow organization leadership through manipulation and testing he still hadn't fully forgiven. But she'd also prepared him by instilling values that transcended strategic thinking, commitment to education, belief in human potential, recognition that power meant responsibility to serve rather than dominate. Those values had kept Ryan grounded through 10 years of moral complexity. They'd guide him through whatever came next: consortium surrender negotiations, Eclipse trust reforms, decisions about how much to reveal to Sophie about the family business when she was old enough to understand. "Daddy, look," Sophie called, pointing to a reading nook designed specifically for children. "Can we stay all day? I want to read everything." Ryan laughed, joining his daughter in the reading nook, picking up a picture book about a librarian who helped children discover magic through stories, appropriately enough. "We can stay as long as you want, sweetheart. That's what libraries are for." Elena sat beside them with Marcus, and for a few hours, Ryan was just a father reading to his children in a library dedicated to his mother's memory. The encrypted messages and board meetings and consortium surrender negotiations could wait. This moment, family together, surrounded by books in space built to serve community, this was what he'd been fighting for all along. Not abstract concepts of democracy or market stability or technological oversight, but concrete reality of people living good lives, pursuing knowledge, raising families, building communities. His mother had understood that, had fought for 40 years to protect it, had sacrificed personal comfort and recognition to ensure her son could continue the work without being corrupted by wealth or broken by betrayal. Ryan had inherited her empire, her organization, her war, but he'd also inherited her values, and those had proven more valuable than any amount of money or strategic advantage. 10 years after Eleanor Mitchell's death, her son sat in a library bearing her name, reading stories to his daughter, planning how to negotiate shadow organization surrender that might finally end a war that had consumed half a century. The work would continue. The choices would remain impossible. The moral complexity wouldn't resolve into easy answers, but Ryan would face it all as himself, imperfect, questioning, occasionally naive, but fundamentally decent and committed to staying that way. That was Eleanor Mitchell's real legacy, not the billions or the empire or the shadow organization, but the son who'd learned to wield enormous power while maintaining the principles that made power worth having. And as Sophie fell asleep against Ryan's shoulder, book open in her lap, Ryan made a silent promise to his mother: "I'll keep fighting your war, Mom, but I'll do it while also being present for my children, while building things that serve communities, while refusing to let the shadow work consume my humanity, the way it sometimes consumed yours. You prepared me perfectly. Now watch me honor that preparation by being both your successor and my own person, by continuing your mission while also correcting your mistakes, by wielding your legacy while also transforming it into something that serves the world you died protecting. The shadow work continues, but so does the light work, the libraries and the literacy programs, and the ordinary moments of reading stories to children who will never know about wars fought to protect their innocence. Both matter. You taught me that. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving you were right to believe I could handle the responsibility you prepared me to carry." Ryan carried his sleeping daughter to the car, Elena beside him with Marcus, security detail, including Victoria, maintaining discreet distance, and drove home through Boston streets toward whatever came next: consortium surrender negotiations, Eclipse trust reforms, decisions about legacy and leadership, and the eternal question of how to wield power without being corrupted by it. The shadow legacy continued, but it continued with light, libraries and families and principles that transcended strategic objectives. Eleanor Mitchell's son had become his mother's successor, while remaining stubbornly, imperfectly, triumphantly himself, and that, finally, was victory worth celebrating.